In 2021, researchers published the results of the most comprehensive ancient DNA study ever conducted on bog bodies from Northern Europe. They analysed genetic material from preserved human remains found in the peat bogs of Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands. Remains that had been lying in cold, airless darkness for over 2,000 years. What the DNA revealed didn't just answer questions about who these people were. It rewrote what scientists thought they knew about the genetic origins of the people living in Scandinavia today. But before the science, there was the morning that changed everything. May 8, 1950. Two brothers, Emil and Viggo Højgaard, were cutting peat from a bog called Tollund Man in central Denmark. Peat was fuel. This was ordinary agricultural work in rural Jutland, the kind of thing families had been doing in this landscape for centuries. The brothers worked with hand tools, slicing through the dense, dark, compressed plant material that had been accumulating in this waterlogged basin for thousands of years. The blades struck something soft. They cleared the material around it carefully. What appeared was a human face, smooth-skinned, eyes closed, expression calm. The features were so perfectly preserved that the brothers initially believed they had found a recent crime victim. The skin had the texture and color of old leather. The stubble on the chin was clearly visible. The expression looked less like death and more like deep, untroubled sleep. Police were called. A forensic pathologist arrived. And it was only when the examination began that the reality became clear. This man had not died recently. Based on the objects found with him and the depth at which he lay, he had been placed in this bog somewhere around 400 BC, roughly 2,350 years before the morning those two brothers found him. His name, given by the archaeologists, was Tollund Man. And the questions his perfectly preserved face raised were questions that would take decades of increasingly sophisticated science to begin to answer. Tollund Man is not an unusual landscape for Jutland. The low-lying interior of the Danish peninsula is dotted with hundreds of similar boggy depressions, waterlogged basins where rainfall collects and sphagnum moss accumulates in slow, cold layers over centuries. To a farmer in 1950, these places were functional. Sources of peat for winter fuel, awkward, marginal land to be worked around. To an archaeologist, they would turn out to be something else entirely. The most remarkable preservation environment for organic material that exists anywhere in the temperate world. Tollund Man is, by any measure, the most studied bog body ever found. The initial examination in 1950 was conducted before the era of modern forensic science. But subsequent studies, particularly a comprehensive re-examination conducted in the 1980s and again using CT scanning technology in 2019, have built one of the most detailed pictures of any individual human life from the Iron Age. What Tollund Man was wearing when he died was simple to the point of poverty. A leather cap pulled down tightly over his head. A smooth leather belt around his waist. Nothing else. No shirt, no shoes, no outer garment. He was naked except for the cap and belt. Around his neck was a braided leather rope, tied in a distinctive noose configuration. The forensic evidence was unambiguous. Tollund Man had been hanged. The mark of the rope was still visible in the preserved skin of his neck, but the manner of death was not the most revealing part of the examination. The contents of his stomach were. Tollund Man's last meal had been a kind of thick porridge, a cooked mixture of cereal grains and seeds. Analysis identified over 40 different plant species in the stomach contents, including cultivated barley, flax, and knotweed, alongside numerous wild plant seeds that would today be classified as weeds and are not consumed in modern diets. The meal contained no meat and no fresh vegetables. The composition and the mix of winter-stored dried seeds strongly suggest the meal was eaten in late winter or early spring, when fresh food was unavailable and stored provisions from the previous harvest were running low. There was something else significant about the meal. The variety of plant species, many of them not cultivated but gathered from field edges and waste ground, points to either deliberate variety for a ritual purpose, or the grinding together of whatever seeds were available at the end of a hard winter. Some researchers have proposed that the specificity of the mixture, with its unusual range of wild plants, suggests a prepared ritual meal rather than a simple daily staple. The eyes and mouth of Tollund Man had been carefully closed after death. This was not the disposal of a criminal. Someone had taken care with this body. Whatever happened at Tollund Fen in approximately 400 BC, it was not careless. The 2019 CT scanning of Tollund Man's remains, conducted at Aarhus University Hospital using medical imaging technology developed for modern diagnostic purposes, produced three-dimensional images of his preserved body at a resolution that was impossible in earlier examinations. The scans confirmed the cause of death and also revealed details about his physical condition at the time of his death. His joints showed no signs of heavy labor. Tollund Man is the most famous, but he is far from alone. The peat bogs of Denmark, northern Germany, and the Netherlands have yielded over 1,000 human remains over the past 2 centuries, with finds ranging from isolated bones to exceptionally complete and well-preserved bodies. Among the most remarkable is a woman discovered in 1879 in a bog called Huldremose in Jutland, whose preserved remains have been subjected to increasingly sophisticated analysis ever since. Huldremose Woman, as she has come to be known, died sometime between 160 BC and 340 AD, a window established through radiocarbon dating. Her preservation was extraordinary. Portions of her hair, her skin, and most remarkably, her clothing survived in the acid-rich, oxygen-poor peat environment that had held her for over 2,000 years. The clothing was the first major revelation. She was dressed in a wool skirt, a plaid-patterned textile woven in a technique that indicates a high level of skill and significant investment of time, and a wool cape. The complexity of the weaving patterns and the quality of the wool fiber preservation made these garments among the best preserved Iron Age textiles in the world, and their analysis transformed what archaeologists knew about textile technology in pre-Roman Northern Europe. These were not the rough coverings of a primitive society. They were sophisticated, carefully made garments. Her right arm had been severed before death, a wound she survived long enough for some healing to occur at the site of the amputation. The isotope analysis, a technique that reads the chemical signatures left in bone and hair by long-term consumption of water and food from specific geographic regions, produced a striking result. The strontium isotope ratios in Huldremose Woman's hair indicated that she had not grown up in Jutland. She had come from somewhere else, possibly from the Scandinavian peninsula or another region of Northern Europe, before ending her life in a Danish bog. She was not local. She was a traveller, and she died far from wherever she had been born. The isotope evidence from Huldremose Woman was one of the earliest applications of this technique to a bog body, and it established a methodology that has since been applied to dozens of other bog individuals. Strontium isotope ratios vary geographically because the underlying geology of different regions produces different isotope signatures in the groundwater, which enters the food chain through plants and animals and is eventually incorporated into the growing bone and hair of people who consume local food and water. The 2021 Ancient DNA study of Northern European bog bodies published in the journal Nature, was one of the largest and most methodologically rigorous ancient genomics projects ever completed on this type of material. The challenge was extreme. The same acidic, waterlogged conditions that preserve skin and hair are deeply hostile to DNA. The tannin compounds and organic acids that chemically transform the soft tissue of bog bodies into something closer to leather also fragment and degrade the genetic material inside the cells. Extracting usable ancient DNA from bog remains had been considered technically impossible for much of the modern genetics era. The breakthrough came from improved extraction protocols and from targeting the petrous bone, the dense inner ear bone that resists chemical attack better than any other skeletal element. Even in bog bodies where the soft tissue was dramatically preserved, it was the inner ear bone that yielded the best quality genetic material. The results challenged one of the most persistent assumptions in popular accounts of Scandinavian prehistory: the idea that the people of Iron Age Scandinavia were the direct biological descendants of the original post-Ice Age hunter-gatherers of Northern Europe, a people of ancient, uninterrupted Nordic heritage. The DNA told a different story. The Bronze Age had brought a massive genetic transformation to Scandinavia. Populations associated with the Yamnaya culture, steppe pastoralists who had expanded westward and northward from the grasslands of modern Russia and Ukraine beginning around 5,000 years ago, had arrived in Northern Europe and mixed with the earlier farmer populations who had themselves replaced much of the ancient hunter-gatherer population before them. By the Iron Age, the people of Denmark and southern Scandinavia were already a genetic synthesis, part ancient Anatolian farmer, part steppe pastoralist, with a residual component of the original European hunter-gatherer ancestry. Some of the bog bodies showed genetic signatures with partial ancestry from southern Europe. Others showed connections to populations from what is now the British Isles. The Iron Age people of Denmark were not a homogeneous population living in isolation. They were connected through trade, conflict, migration, and intermarriage to people from across a much wider European world. The 2021 study also provided the first genetic data precise enough to address the question of whether specific bog body individuals were related to each other. In several cases, pairs of individuals deposited in the same bog within a relatively narrow time window, the DNA confirmed that they were not family members. They came from different genetic backgrounds. Why did these people end up in the bogs? The archaeological evidence, combined with the classical historical record, points toward one primary explanation: deliberate ritual deposition. The practice of placing offerings, and sometimes people, into watery places as acts of religious devotion. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing around 98 AD in a text called Germania, described the religious practices of the Germanic peoples of Northern Europe with a combination of fascinated anthropological detail and Roman cultural condescension. Among the things he recorded was the worship of a goddess he called Nerthus, which translates roughly as Mother Earth or Earth Mother, whose cult involved processions, ritual purification, and, at the culmination of the ceremonies, the drowning of the enslaved attendants who had participated in the rites in a sacred lake or bog. Whether Tacitus was accurately reporting what he had learned from informants, or whether he was embellishing with the kind of sensational detail Roman readers expected from accounts of barbarian practices, is debated. But the physical evidence from the bogs is consistent with ritual killing rather than ordinary crime or punishment. The care with which many bog bodies were treated after death, eyes closed, limbs arranged, in some cases wrapped or covered, suggests that the deaths were conducted according to a ritual protocol. The noose around Tollund Man's neck was not the rough rope of an execution. It was a carefully braided leather cord. The closing of his eyes and mouth, the positioning of his body in the bog. These are the actions of people who believed they were doing something important and sacred. The consumption of a prepared ritual meal before death, as the stomach contents of Tollund Man and several other bog bodies suggest, fits a pattern documented across many ancient cultures in which the person to be sacrificed was given a final meal as part of the ceremony. The identity of the individuals selected for bog deposition remains one of the field's most debated questions. Some scholars argue that the quality of clothing and physical evidence of a well-nourished life in some bog bodies indicates that these were high-status individuals, perhaps even willing participants who understood their death as an honor. Others point to evidence of physical trauma, bound limbs, and signs of struggle in some cases as evidence of coercion. The DNA from the 2021 study added a dimension no one had previously been able to test: whether bog bodies from the same sites were family members. The answer, in several cases, was no. Individuals deposited in the same bog over extended periods were not closely related. They came from different families, possibly different communities. Not all of the human remains found in northern European bogs represent ritual deposition. Some of them represent something considerably more brutal: the aftermath of large-scale organized violence between competing tribal confederations. The most dramatic example is not from Denmark, but from the nearby region, the Thorsberg and Illerup Årdal sites in Jutland, where archaeologists have recovered thousands of deliberately destroyed weapons, items of military equipment, and human bones deposited in bog contexts that strongly suggest they represent the spoils and casualties of major battles. The deposition of captured weapons in bogs, bent, broken, and rendered unusable before offering, was a documented ritual practice across Iron Age Northern Europe, a way of dedicating military victory to the divine powers of the watery world. Ancient DNA analysis of human remains from these conflict-related bog sites has contributed to a broader picture of population dynamics in Iron Age Scandinavia. The genetic data shows that the people of this period were not static. Trade routes documented archaeologically, amber moving southward from the Baltic coast to the Roman Empire, Roman luxury goods moving northward in return, carried not just objects, but people. The DNA evidence confirms low but detectable levels of admixture with populations from southern Central Europe, consistent with the movement of traders, soldiers, and enslaved people along these routes. The arrival of Roman commercial influence in Northern Europe had genetic as well as material consequences. DNA from Iron Age individuals in Denmark shows traces of ancestry consistent with populations from the Roman frontier zone, the Rhine-Danube border regions, where Germanic warriors served as mercenaries in the Roman military and where Germanic-Roman contact was most intense. These individuals never set foot on Danish soil themselves, but their genetic signature made it there nonetheless, carried in the bodies of their descendants or trading partners. The Iron Age skeleton record from bog and burial contexts both shows skeletal evidence of healed and unhealed combat injuries, cut marks on bones, blunt force trauma, embedded weapon fragments, that document a society in which organized violence was a recurring feature of life. These were not peaceful communities. The bogs received the overflow of a world in which conflict was both mundane and sacred. The genetic data from the 2021 study also addressed the question of sex ratios among bog body individuals. The sample was approximately evenly split between male and female individuals, which is consistent with a ritual practice that selected individuals based on criteria other than gender. One of the most unexpected scientific dividends of the bog body research program has been the recovery of biological material that goes beyond the human genome itself. The gut contents of well-preserved bog bodies, including the stomach contents that revealed Tollund Man's last meal, have been subjected to metagenomic analysis, a technique that sequences all the DNA present in a sample, not just human DNA, to reconstruct the entire biological community that existed in or around the individual at the time of death. The results have opened a window into aspects of Iron Age life that skeletal remains alone could never reveal. The intestinal contents of several bog bodies contain DNA from intestinal parasites, roundworms, whipworms, and liver flukes that document the parasitic load that these individuals carried. This is not a surprising finding. Most pre-modern human populations carried significant intestinal parasite burdens, and the presence of specific parasite species provides information about diet, water sources, and sanitary conditions. What the bog body parasite data specifically indicates is a population in close contact with animals, particularly cattle and pigs, whose fecal contamination of water and food sources was a routine feature of daily life. More striking was the detection of ergot fungus DNA in the gut contents of several individuals. Ergot, Claviceps purpurea, is a fungus that infects rye and other grain crops, producing alkaloid compounds that cause a condition called ergotism in people and animals who consume infected grain. The symptoms of ergotism include convulsions, burning sensations in the limbs, and vivid hallucinations. Some researchers have proposed that the presence of ergot in bog body gut contents may indicate deliberate consumption, that the individuals destined for bog deposition were given ergot-contaminated grain as part of a ritual process intended to alter their state of consciousness before death. This is speculative, and the presence of ergot may simply reflect contamination of grain stores that were not inspected carefully. But the possibility that Iron Age ritual practice included psychoactive substances is consistent with broader evidence from European prehistoric and protohistoric cultures. The microbiome data also revealed the specific composition of plant communities that grew around the bog sites during the Iron Age, pollen and plant DNA preserved in the peat alongside the human remains, allowing researchers to reconstruct the landscape in which these people lived and died with extraordinary precision. The pollen record preserved in the peat layers immediately surrounding the bog bodies is particularly informative. The fact that human remains can survive for 2,000 years in a peat bog, with skin, hair, fingernails, and internal organs intact while the bones dissolve, is one of the more counterintuitive phenomena in archaeology. The explanation lies in the chemistry of the peat bog environment itself. Peat bogs form in waterlogged basins where dead plant material, primarily sphagnum moss, accumulates faster than it decomposes. In normal soil conditions, bacteria break down organic material relatively quickly, returning its components to the chemical cycle. In a peat bog, several factors combine to inhibit this process almost completely. First, the water in a sphagnum bog is highly acidic, typically with a pH between 3 and 4, similar to vinegar. Most bacteria cannot survive at this acidity level. Second, the bog environment is nearly anaerobic, without the oxygen that most decomposition bacteria require. Third, and most importantly for preservation, sphagnum moss produces a compound called sphagnan, which actively binds to proteins in a process chemically similar to the leather tanning process used by human tanners. This is why bog bodies emerge from the peat with skin that has been, in effect, chemically preserved, converted from living tissue into something with the texture and durability of cured hide. The paradox of bone dissolution is explained by the same acidity that preserves the soft tissue. Bone is largely composed of calcium phosphate, which dissolves readily in acidic conditions. The acid that preserves the proteins of skin and muscle simultaneously dissolves the mineral matrix of bone. This is why bog bodies often present as skin-covered forms with little or no skeletal structure remaining inside. The bones have been chemically consumed, while the exterior tissue was chemically preserved. Extracting ancient DNA from this material proved extraordinarily difficult for decades. The same tannin compounds that preserve the soft tissue cross-link with DNA molecules, making them difficult to extract and sequence. The petrous bone, where it survived, was the key. CT scanning of bog bodies, now standard practice for any newly discovered remains, allows researchers to locate and assess the condition of the petrous bone before any destructive sampling is done, maximizing the chance of successful genetic recovery. The 3D facial reconstruction technology that has been applied to several bog bodies over the past decade uses the CT scan data in combination with computational models of soft tissue distribution to generate visual estimates of what these individuals looked like in life. What does the DNA of the bog bodies mean for the people living in Denmark and Scandinavia today? The 2021 study provided data precise enough to trace specific genetic lineages from the Iron Age individuals to modern Scandinavian populations. The ancient DNA confirmed that the people buried or deposited in the bogs of Jutland 2,000 years ago were real biological ancestors of the modern Danish population. Not a separate, extinct people, but part of a continuous human line whose genetic contributions flow forward into the present. The study also contributed to the growing scientific understanding of when and how specific physical traits that are strongly associated with Northern European ancestry, light skin pigmentation, blue eye color, blonde hair, became common in Scandinavia. The data shows that these traits, which are sometimes colloquially treated as ancient and primordial features of Nordic people, were in fact not universal in the population at the time the bog bodies were placed in the peat. Variants associated with blue eye color were already widespread by the Iron Age, but the full constellation of light pigmentation traits was still not fixed in the population. The genetic diversity visible in the bog body samples reflects a population that was still, in some pigmentation-related genes, in the process of reaching the frequencies now seen in modern Scandinavia. The research also documented specific disease-related genetic variants that can be traced from ancient populations into modern Scandinavians. Some of these variants, associated with elevated risk for specific conditions, including certain autoimmune disorders, appear at frequencies in the ancient Iron Age samples that help explain their current distribution in modern Nordic populations. And for some Danish citizens who have taken commercial DNA tests, the connection is personal and direct. The genetic matching algorithms used by ancestry companies now include Iron Age Scandinavian reference populations, built in part from bog body data. When a modern Dane receives an ancestry result indicating Scandinavian Iron Age ancestry, they are being connected to the same genetic community from which Tollund Man and Huldremose Woman came. For researchers, the Silkeborg Museum collection, which includes not only Tollund Man, but dozens of other bog individuals from across Jutland, represents one of the most important ancient biological archives in Europe. The application of shotgun sequencing to the museum's older collections, combined with newly excavated material, continues to expand the dataset year by year. Let's bring the whole picture together, because the story of the Danish bog bodies is not just about one unusual method of preservation or one puzzling ancient custom. It is a story about what it means to exist in time, and what the most unlikely physical archives can tell us about the full complexity of human experience. The peat bogs of Jutland held their secrets for between 2,000 and 3,000 years. They held them because of chemistry, because the unique combination of acid, cold, and the absence of oxygen created conditions that converted human tissue into something that time could not easily destroy. The preservation was not designed, it was accidental. The people who placed the bog bodies in the water were not thinking about archaeology. They were thinking about the gods, about the harvest, about the safety of the community, about whatever transaction they believed they were conducting with the dark water. What the DNA tells us about those people cuts through 2,000 years of silence with a precision that no written record could match. It tells us that they were not the isolated, purely indigenous Northern Europeans of popular imagination. They were the product of multiple waves of migration, ancient hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers from Anatolia, Bronze Age steppe pastoralists, whose genetic streams had merged in the centuries before the Iron Age to create the people of Jutland. Some of those people had come from elsewhere in Europe, within living memory of their own deaths. Some carried genetic signatures that connected them to the Mediterranean world. The 2021 Ancient DNA study confirmed something that genetics has now demonstrated across every region of Europe that has been studied in sufficient depth. There is no European population with an ancient, uninterrupted, genetically pure heritage stretching back to the primordial past. Every population is a mixture. Every population is the product of movement, encounter, and blending across generations and centuries. The bog bodies also tell us something about the human relationship with death that transcends culture and era. The care with which Tollund Man's eyes were closed, the quality of the clothing on Huldremose Woman, the deliberate preparation of a last meal. These details document a society that treated the act of death, even the deaths it deliberately caused, with ritual seriousness. Whatever the theology behind the bog depositions, it was not casual. It was the expression of a coherent belief system in which the boundary between the living world and the world of the dead was located precisely in the dark, cold water of the peat bog.